Have a jury remain standing for the jury.
Everybody be seated, please. Hope y'all got to get out and enjoy the sunshine for at least a few minutes. It's pretty out there. You may proceed, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Your Honor. It's okay if I call you Mr. Knox? I know you said you'd rather call Mike. I'm not allowed to do that one.
Whatever you want to do.
All right. Mr. Knox, a couple of things I want to clarify. Mr. Princeman is asking you questions about those patterns that were in the foyer area and eventually in the bathroom area. He kept referring to them as shoe prints. Isn't it true that we can't say that those are in fact shoe prints? What they are patterns that could potentially possibly be shoe prints.
That's correct, yes.
Right. So they're patterns. You're not saying they are in fact shoe prints.
That's correct.
And in fact, Florida Department of Law Enforcement went back and tested it and found one that was in fact a shoe print, and the rest of them were indiscriminate or undeterminate nature.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. The other thing I want to clarify is nothing in your analysis that we just walked through and looked at is inconsistent with this being done by one singular person, correct?
I don't think there's anything that just flat out excludes a single person. I think that would be probably correct.
All right. Let's go and let's talk about certain things. And as I understand it then, what you basically are doing and what you did here is you go back and you look at the crime scene. And in some ways, not necessarily, I'm not saying you're being critical of Tallahassee Police Department, but you're pointing out things that could be done in addition to it.
That's correct. Yes.
And of course, with everything else, hindsight usually is 20/20.
Agreed.
Fair to say that there's really not ever a crime scene ever that there's not additional things that could be done.
I think that's fair.
Okay. You also had some experience in investigations, non-crime scene, where you're a homicide investigator as well as your road officer as well, correct?
That's right.
Responded to domestic calls and things like that?
That's correct.
You would agree with me that typically when you're talking about kids that are 3 years old and 6 years old, they're not going to join in the fight in a domestic.
I think that's fair. Yes.
And in fact, most of the time, 3-year-olds, 6-year-olds, kids of that in that time are actually going to hide from the fight.
Often, yes.
Okay. All right. And we talked about, so let's just let's go through some stuff real quick if we can, and I'm going to, well, unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to go over there to manipulate this thing. Let me see.
Not helping Madam Court Reporter too much, Mr. Fuchs.
I was talking to myself, I apologize.
I understand that causes her problems.
So let's just go through some items here. Item number 4 here, or photograph number 4 and 5, which are the two photographs of that window in the bathroom. First and foremost, this window is what, about 8 to 10 inches wide? Pretty narrow?
Pretty narrow. I don't know exact measurements, but it's a fairly small window.
And then you testified that you did not find any evidence in reviewing this particular case that there was any processing done for fingerprints.
That's correct.
Showing you Forensic Specialist Annie Pressey's report. I should take a look at page number 2 there. Doesn't that report, Annie Pressey, say that she actually processed it, both interior and exterior, for fingerprints?
Yeah, she used bichromatic powder. That's correct.
Again, review, mistakes get made, right?
That's correct.
A lot of stuff with this case.
That's correct.
Let's talk about the phone cord if we can. I keep hitting the wrong button. this telephone cord indicated that it had been cut, right?
Yes.
And part of your determination is that there was a struggle ongoing in this particular case, and that's what probably led to it being cut?
Well, I don't know exactly at what point it got cut, but the cord appears to be cut in one place, and it appears to actually be pulled from the wall in another spot.
And that's a fair point. You don't know when this was actually cut, right?
That's correct.
And in fact, Brandy didn't suffer, Ms. Peters didn't suffer any lacerations that were consistent with being from a knife, did she?
Not that I recall, no.
All right. So if they're struggling in this particular area over this, and the phone was cut with a knife or scissors, you would expect at some point if they're struggling, she would have some sort of wound from a knife or something that would cause that particular cut. Would you not?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, it doesn't guarantee that she would have a wound, but yes, if you would anticipate that there was knife or scissors present.
Okay. And she didn't have any of those wounds, so we really don't know that this has any connection at all with anything going on, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then you talked about these black scuff marks, both here and on the doorway that goes into the master bathroom. And you talked about how they could be analyzed for comparison purposes, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You would have to have something to compare them to, would you not?
Right. You could do analysis just for chemistry without something to compare, but to be able to make a match, you would have to have some other standard that you're comparing it to.
Okay. And your client wasn't arrested for a year after this, right?
I believe that's correct.
All right. So really getting whatever he wore that particular evening really isn't possible, was it?
The likelihood certainly diminishes as time passes, yeah.
Okay. And in fact, he wasn't even identified as a witness, as even a potential suspect or person of interest on the days following this event, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. And one of the other things you brought up was this photograph and subsequent photographs of the bullet that was through the door and subsequent trajectory rod, correct?
That's correct.
And you said that there's really no documentation of what position the door was in because we see it in this position here, and then later on, in the next photograph, we see it actually open,
That's correct.
right? Isn't it true that there were numerous photographs taken of the scene as they walked through it and as they initially got there? And in fact, there's an entire video that shows before the crime scene did anything at all, correct?
That's correct. That's
All right,
correct.
and it documents that this door was actually in this position at that time, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then actually the purpose of this one is actually to show that the trajectory actually went through the door and then later deposited it there at 17, right?
That's correct.
So it really was documented as far as the angle wasn't, but it was documented as to the position of the door, correct?
Right, and I think to clarify the point that I made there was that you can typically attach the trajectory rod to the next point where the bullet goes and then show what the position had, the door position at the time of the shot, and that wasn't reflected, but you're correct in that there are a lot of shots or photographs that show that the door was almost closed during the time that they initially encountered the scene.
But regardless, that shot came from the master bedroom, did it not?
That's correct.
Okay. And whenever you, let's go if we can, talk about your blood spatter analysis there at the doorway exiting the home. You made findings that there were impacts that were made on Ms. Peters, both while she was standing upright, later on down by the doorknob area,
That's right.
and then finally on the ground.
That's correct.
So she was struck at all three different levels.
That's correct.
You're aware that's contrary to Mr. LaFort's testimony just the other day where he said that she was struck only on the ground?
I wasn't here for his testimony, so I don't know.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the weapon that was used. You keep talking about a bat.
Well, I mentioned bat as being something that would have the length, but it could be anything that's long like that. So it could be a bat, it could be a crowbar, it could be, you know, a number of different things, a stick, anything that has just enough length to be able to get that blood spatter up high like it was.
Isn't it true that if a bat was utilized, we'd be looking at more of a linear type of wound?
It would depend on the particular weapon, but yes, I mean, if you have just a straight weapon, then you should have straight linear wounds. So you obviously have a weapon that has some other surfaces or multiple weapons, as I said before.
So even though you're using the bat as an example, you're not saying there was a bat was used in this case?
No.
And in fact, it's not consistent with the wounds. A bat would not be consistent with these wounds, would it not?
Not with all of them. Some of them could have been, but certainly not all of them.
Which one?
Well, there's some linear abrasions, particularly the back of the head. There's a laceration. Those are fairly linear. But the other ones that are curved, the ones that have teardrop shapes to them, things like that, would not be from a bat.
And in fact, the skull fractures are not consistent with that either, because they're round, are they not?
There were some linear ones, but there are some round, ovoid type ones as well.
And it's hard to tell from those photographs, but what we're really talking about is about an inch, are we not, round?
That's correct.
So very small.
That's correct.
You would agree that that's not a bat?
That's definitely not a bat, yeah.
And you mentioned a crowbar. Also true that a crowbar wouldn't have made those injuries as well.
No, not unless it's got some type of attachment or fitting on it or something that makes it, that would have that shape. A typical crowbar would not.
Okay. And you would actually agree with me that as it relates to a revolver, that a revolver is in fact consistent with each and every one of those wounds as far as the shape and curvatures and everything like that. Revolver's got multiple, well, let me ask you that first.
I don't know that I would say it's consistent with each and every one of those wounds. A revolver does obviously have different surfaces to it that could cause different types of wounds. But it would not cause the blood spatter that you saw there, and it would not necessarily cause, I mean, like for example, the ovoid fracture, those are, as you pointed out, about an inch in diameter. There really wouldn't be anything on a revolver that would be an inch round that would cause that. So I don't think a revolver would be the weapon.
You've been working in firearms for a while.
Yes.
Familiar with the old 32s that were the old police guns?
Yes.
They had a very small round handle, did they not?
Yes. It's not exactly round, but yes, it's fairly small.
Pretty close to
handle
being
it.
round though.
Pretty close.
But that's the same shape as we were talking about, is it not?
I don't know that I would say it's the same shape. I mean, the ovoid fractures that are on there are pretty round, but really without a specific one to compare it to, there wouldn't be any way to know for sure.
You would agree with me, first and foremost, that the gun barrel could cause the smaller lacerations in the hands and head of Miss Peters.
Possibly. I don't think you could exclude it.
Okay. You would agree with me that the curved lacerations on the head could be caused by the hammer and or the cylinder of a revolver, correct?
You could potentially get some the curved abrasions and or curved lacerations, things like that from.
And actually, what you
certain
told
portions.
Mr. Prince earlier was that it could be a singular weapon with all kinds of different shapes to it, correct?
That's correct.
And that would be consistent with what a revolver is it not?
A revolver would have different shapes and different surfaces. Yes, that's correct.
Let's talk back. Okay, so finally, the one thing you didn't agree, you said that it wouldn't necessarily cause that 1 inch round, correct?
Right. I mean, you'd have to have one to compare it to know for certain.
But it's consistent with that, is it not?
I don't think you could just outright eliminate it, but you'd have to have something to compare it to. If you had one that had that type of a shape to it that would match that, then it could be included, but it would have to have that sort of a shape to it.
And it would be consistent then with grabbing a longer barreled 32 caliber and swinging it as if you would a hammer, would it not?
As far as the ovoid fractures, I think that's you couldn't exclude that.
Okay. It'd have to take somebody that can give a lot of force, would it not?
It would take a lot of force. That's correct.
Somebody that's strong,
Yes.
used to dealing with heavier metals. picking them up by dealing with, I mean, picking them up, moving around metal as a part of their employment?
I mean, I would say strong. If that employment involves needing a lot of strength, then that's a conclusion you could probably make, but.
Let's talk a little bit about that shovel. Oops, wrong button again. When we're looking at this shovel right here, shovel's been used, has it not?
It looks like it has, yes.
Pretty good amount. We've got striations here that indicate it's been used for digging.
Yes,
Residue of excuse me, residue of dirt.
yes.
Okay. This isn't really consistent with the Mexican cartel purchasing it in order to leave it as a calling sign, is it?
I mean, I don't know much about Mexican cartels and what they do, but I think what I would say is it's not a brand new, straight from the store shovel.
Okay. And in fact, Brandy's, as you indicated earlier, Brandy's blood was actually found in numerous parts of this particular shovel, was it not? Indicating it was there at the time. Not that she was struck with it, but it had
Right.
the spatter.
There is some blood on it, yes, that's correct.
Earlier, you also talked about an earring, and I don't think I took note of what slide that one was, but you said that it had been found near the shovel.
I don't think it was near the shovel, it was near, if memory serves me, it was in the hallway area, next to it's next to a baseboard, so it's by a wall.
Okay. You got that zoomed out on? Showing the previously introduced as 28R.
State's exhibit.
Yes, State's exhibit, excuse me. It actually was found back in the bedroom, was it?
Oh, it
not?
was in the bedroom, yeah, okay.
And then there's a second one that was found on the tile area of the entryway close to where Brandy was laying, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Not by the shovel?
That's correct.
All right, I might have misunderstood you. I'm not trying to say you said
Yeah.
something different. I just want to make sure I cleared that up. I think Miss Dugan's throwing things at me. You talked earlier about a lot of this events, if you will. There was a center cushion on the couch that had a large amount of blood deposited there that was consistent with being Tamiya's. DNA analysis showed it was Tamaya. Remember Tamiya's? Do you remember that?
Yes,
It would kind of indicate, I think you were talking about earlier about where events where you would agree that would indicate where she was shot and then later pooled that blood, correct?
that's correct.
And then in looking at your analysis and striations there at that door, it appears that she was carried into the bathtub and then placed on top of her brother and sister, correct?
I think that's correct, yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the length of the weapon. I know you keep saying it would be a longer one. We know it's not really bat. We know it's not really a crowbar. And those are the examples you use. Isn't it true it could be simply from someone taking their arm and casting it off? You would agree an arm is a 2 to 3 foot weapon, if you will, holding something that they're using to beat somebody. So that cast off could have been done simply from the arm motion, could it not?
I mean, I would say I could not definitively say 100% that that's not possible, but that's very much inconsistent with what you see in crime scenes where weapons are identified and you recognize that shorter weapons held in the hand without a lot of length to the weapon, you don't get high spatter like that. The longer weapons give you that high spatter up on ceilings and high up on walls.
True, but that obviously. But you would agree with me that what it takes to get spatter to one location to another is the velocity of that particular spatter.
The velocity of it, yes, and when you're talking about like cast off, you have to get it high enough so that as it's coming down, it reaches the area where it's located.
Right, sure. And when you're talking about velocity, obviously, certain of us can move our arms a lot faster velocity than others.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. And really, when it comes down to physics, it's the amount of that velocity. Physics dictate where it actually goes. You can generate more velocity with a baseball bat type of situation, but at the same time, somebody can generate that same velocity with just using their arm, could they not?
It would be a very forceful movement of the arm, but I don't think you could exclude that.
Okay. And you would agree with me that this brutality of this attack on Brandy Peters in the foyer was in fact something that was extremely done out of anger and frustrations and things of that nature, is the kind of injuries you would see to this kind of beating, would you not?
I mean, typically when you see strongly violent attacks like that, anger could be associated with that, but I don't have a mechanism to diagnose and say that that's necessarily out of anger. That could be for a variety of reasons. It just, from a reconstruction standpoint, it's a very forceful, violent attack.
But clearly something that's personal to the person that's doing the attacking.
I don't know that I would agree with that, simply because I think that's sort of not quite really within the wheelhouse of what I'm looking at.
So you're not disagreeing, you're just saying it's not my wheelhouse.
Right. I mean, because the thing is for me to say that as an expert opinion, I'd have to have some diagnostic tool or some way of really coming to that conclusion. I don't think that your premise is wrong, but I don't think I can give that as an expert opinion and say, yes, I can diagnose and tell whether or not somebody was angry or not angry based upon the attack.
Sorry, I took a lot of notes, unfortunately, so I gotta look through and make sure I'm covering stuff I want to. You talked earlier about void patterns, and you showed that foyer where you had the one void pattern area.
That's right.
It's the only void pattern you found, correct?
Right, that one side of the foyer.
And void patterns are created by a person that's there or something that blocks the trajectory of the blood, correct?
That's correct.
And you found one of those?
One area of the foyer, one side of the foyer, basically, yes.
Photograph we're looking at in your photograph number 122, and I believe you said this is a trajectory that goes from top to bottom.
Right.
Ms. Peters is only 5'3".
That's correct.
So her attacker probably is a little bit, either she had to be laying down, as you talked to earlier, or it could be simply that he's taller than she is, they're struggling for the weapon, and in the struggle, her arms got hold of it and it goes down trajectory. Entirely possible as well?
That's possible. Just what you can tell from that is that the weapon has to be above the location of the wound.
And just for clarification, you were in fact hired by the defense.
That's correct.
And we already heard from your partner that he gets a salary, I think it's $2,500 a month, or a week. How much have y'all, between the two of y'all, billed the defense? I think the state's paying for it, but overall for your work on this particular case?
I don't know what the amount is. I haven't looked at the records to know exactly.
Fair to say it's a pretty good chunk of change? How many hours?
It's been quite a few hours of work, so I mean, it's going to be a fair amount.
Yeah. And how much do you get paid an hour?
I think here it's $200 an hour.
Sorry, I'm trying to find there it is, okay. Now, earlier you talked about the fact that you couldn't tell whether somebody was in fact a left-handed person or a right-handed person doing the shooting. And I understand you can't really tell which hand the gun was in,
That's correct.
right? But when we look at this particular diagram, you can see a convergence here of two different gunshot angles, are you not?
You do, yes.
Okay. And that conversion is right up against the wall, is it not?
It's fairly close to the wall.
And we go back and we look at this, the trajectory of these. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. This is actually facing at this angle, is it not? So it's actually coming from a little bit left to a little bit right and downward, is it not?
It is.
So you would agree with me, in order for that to be fired by a right-handed individual, they would have to be almost like this shooting, would they not?
No, I don't think you'd have to be that close to the wall. They could be out a little bit, but you really can't tell handedness from anything related to trajectories because, like I demonstrated, I could hold a gun this way, I could hold a gun this way, and I'm using two different hands, but yet the gun doesn't change position. So you really I would not ever say you could tell anything about handedness from the way that a shot's fired.
So you would not agree with me that that's more consistent with someone pointing with his back this way and then rotating and shooting out that doorway?
No, I don't think you could make that assertion.
Okay. Earlier you talked about a single drop that was a vertical drop in the foyer. If you were processing this crime scene, you certainly wouldn't swallow every single drop of blood, would you not?
Oh, no, definitely not.
And in fact, multiple swabs were taken from blood all over the foyer, the hallways, and everything like that, and all gave indications for being Brandy Peters' blood, correct?
That's correct.
So in going through your analysis, it's entirely possible that the perpetrator came in and was led into the home. There was no sign of forced entry, correct?
That's correct.
Tamaya Peters is sitting on the couch. Apparently her back of her head is turned towards whoever it is that assaulted her, correct? Because she was shot in the back of the head.
Shot in the back of the head, yes.
Okay. And she was shot right there as she sat on the couch.
That's what it would appear, yes.
Your experience in a homicide investigator, as well as your crime scene, would indicate that she probably knew who that person was if she had her back to her and was just sitting there calmly.
I don't think I would diagnose that simply saying, I can't say that it's a matter of knowing the person versus not realizing that the person's there. There could be different alternatives to why she's got her head turned. In fact, you don't even know that she's sitting there with her back to the person the entire time. All you know is at the moment of the shot that it's coming from the back of the head.
But it's not inconsistent with that, is it not?
Well, I think in terms of inconsistent, you're correct. I mean, you couldn't rule out that possibility.
And you said earlier, you take a look at the crime scene as a whole and not just the individual things, correct?
That's correct.
Sign of no forced entry, the sign that she's right there at the couch, kind of indicates that somebody was let into the home and would have been standing there, correct?
I would say you couldn't exclude that, but I couldn't diagnose it that way and say that it has to be that or that that's somehow consistent with that as opposed to other possibilities.
And you would agree that that is probably the thing that started this entire event? In the front door, first person there shot?
Really no way to tell that. There's nothing here to sequence when she's shot in comparison to when Brandy Peters is killed or any of the other children.
Well, it's close proximity. That
Close
woman was,
proximity,
correct.
that's correct.
And so it's not consistent with her running away from whoever it was that was shooting at her and been shot from a distance, correct?
Well, again, I mean, all you can tell from the shot is what's happening at the instant of the shot. So you couldn't even exclude that and say, well, you could run away from me and then I could catch up to you and shoot you and still be in close range. So I don't have any way to tell what's happening in the events leading up to or immediately subsequent to, just that at the moment of the shot, firearm is from behind the head and that it's close.
And then the attack on Miss Peters happens at the beginning, back in her master bedroom, correct?
That's where it would appear that it begins.
And there's certainly at least one struggle over a gun. You have the one high shot that went out the window as well as the shot through her boob. I know you can't sequence when each shot occurred, but it appears that there was certainly a struggle there over the gun.
Yes.
And at some point, she took refuge, if you will, in the bathroom area because the person's shooting at her when she's in the bathroom, correct?
That's correct.
And somehow she's able to not only escape that bathroom, but also her bedroom in general, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Possibly when the person is reloading it, because we're talking about a revolver, right?
Yeah, I could be any particular reason, but that's certainly a possibility.
And her ability to escape not only out of the bathroom there, but out of the bedroom in itself kind of gives away that we're only talking about one individual, because if you had multiple persons, somebody's going to be blocking those exits, would they not?
Again, I really couldn't say that. I mean, you could make that inference, but there's nothing in terms of the physical evidence that would establish that that is or is not the case.
Is or is not the case. It certainly is within the realm of your examination.
That's correct. There's nothing where I could say that there was or wasn't somebody blocking a door or anything like that, because there are multiple possibilities. Somebody could be there and she just managed to slip past that person. There's just no way to really discern whether or not somebody was or was not there.
And then given the fact that we're talking about a 3 and a 6-year-old that are still survivors, being Javante and Tanaya, certainly reasonable to feel they went and hid in the bathroom, right?
I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think the physical evidence necessarily says that that did or didn't happen.
Okay. And then whoever it is obviously chased her down the hallway,
Yes.
drops a couple of blood on the floor as well as the transfer that we see on the wall.
That's right.
Actually shoots again down that hallway and leaves that projectile that's out there by that the artificial tree, right?
Yes.
And somehow she gets out away from that person and out the front door.
That's correct.
She's struck outside the front door at different levels, both upright and a little bit lower, at doorknob level.
That's correct.
She's pulled back into the home,
That's correct.
and then that person is beating her there in the hallway, both upright, doorknob, and on the ground.
That's correct.
And then following all this, goes back and drowns the kids.
Well, again, I can't really sequence that. Whether they were drowned before, during, or after, I couldn't say.
But that fits the evidence, is it not, as a whole?
Well, I think the way I would say it is I couldn't eliminate that, but I wouldn't say that it necessarily fits, because that's implying that that's the solution, that that's the answer. It could be any one of those possibilities. I mean, there's just no way from the physical evidence to sequence when they were killed in comparison to when she was killed or anything like that.
And then takes Tamaya, carries her in there, and rejoins her with her brother and sister and puts her on top.
Certainly in terms of the positioning in the tub, that's correct, yes.
And nothing in your analysis says that Henry Segura didn't do this.
I think that's correct. I mean, I'm not, I'm certainly not saying he could not have had any involvement. I'm just laying out what the physical evidence indicates.
Redirect.
Mr. Knox, Mr. Fuchs first wanted to ask you about the 5 impressions noted in and around the foyer, around Ms. Peters' body. Although you can't eliminate the possibility that those are impressions from things other than shoes, I just want to clarify, what do you, based on your experience, training, and education, view those impressions to have most likely come from?
Footwear.
And to clarify again, none of those patterns are consistent with each other. There are different impressions, different patterns to each of those impressions, correct?
That's correct.
And likewise, law enforcement was excluded from having deposited those impressions, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. One of the things that Mr. Fuchs asked you about was the scuffs on the wall near the phone that was ripped out of, near the phone cord that was ripped out of the wall. And you indicated that if a year passed, that perhaps any assailant who was wearing footwear consistent with those scuffs or had any other object that was consistent with those scuffs could have discarded it within that year, correct?
That's correct.
However, if a cleanup scene was located with new clothing tags and new shoe tags, and if the person had a search warrant executed upon their home within 10 days of the murder, you would expect that perhaps you could take the shoes from that home and compare those to the material that caused those scuffs, correct?
That's correct.
But that didn't happen in this case, right?
That's correct.
By which I mean they didn't compare any shoes that they took during the execution of the search warrant at Mr. Segura's home.
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Fuchs wanted to ask you about the possibility that that the high cast-off we saw in this case above the door was caused during a time when an assailant may have been standing up and Ms. Peters standing up. I think first of all we need to clarify again the difference between impact spatter and cast-off. Can you clarify that again?
Well, the impact spatter would be that if you have a surface, say, a person with an injury with blood on it, and you hit that, then you're going to send blood spattering away from that wound. Cast off is that whatever the weapon is or whatever you're swinging has blood on it, and as you swing it, it distributes blood onto whatever surfaces are nearby.
And those big globs of blood that we saw above the door traveling in a downward trajectory, are those cast off, meaning that they came off whatever weapon was being swung, or is that impact spatter?
There's definitely cast off in the higher spatters. There's some impact spatters fairly high up the walls, but there's definitely cast off as well. The impact spatters sort of distribute out in a sort of a fanning out type of direction versus cast off that goes in the direction of whatever the object is that's swung.
And so in all the homicide cases that you've worked, both as a homicide detective, as a crime scene detective, and as a reconstructionist, have you ever seen cast off that high in the air with a downward trajectory, indicating it was even higher before it hit the wall, from any size revolver, let alone a small little .32?
No.
Okay. So in your opinion, that cast off was most likely not caused from any kind of handgun?
That's correct.
Rather, it was caused by an object at least a couple of feet in length. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, I want to ask you about the wounds to the victim. Let's talk first about that almost perfectly round wound on the crown of her head that was discernible once the scalp was pulled back. To your knowledge, are there 32 caliber revolvers that have perfectly circular surfaces anywhere on them?
No, not for that. I think Mr. Fuchs had referred to the bottom of the handle where you get a sort of rounded surface, but it's not circular. It's more of I don't want to say oval shape, but somewhat rounded, but not perfectly circular.
Kind of like maybe like a football without points on the end, right? like that.
Yes, something more like that.
More similar to the wound to the left side of Miss Peters' forehead that, when peeled back, looked like a depression that was roughly egg-shaped.
That's correct.
The circular wound on top of the head would have to correspond with a circular weapon or object. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Based on your training, experience, and education, although it's possible that all of the injuries could have come from different surfaces on a single item, what do you view to be the most likely cause of all the varying wounds upon Miss Peters' body?
Most likely would be that there's more than one weapon that's involved, because there's a variety of different surfaces, and then when you couple that with the blood spatter, it would tend to indicate that there's most likely multiple objects that are being used.
Okay. Asking about the shovel briefly, based on the quantity of cast off or spatter, blood spatter present on the carpet around where the shovel was located, although some blood was identified on the shovel, if the shovel was on the ground where it's depicted in the pictures, would you expect that that shovel would have more spatter than was ultimately discovered upon it?
I would think that that there would be more spatter, and I think the purplish spatters that seem to have come from the leucocrystal violet that was processed nearby tend to indicate that if you've got any type of spattering going on in the area where Brandy Peters was killed, that it would be close enough to spatter on it. I mean, I couldn't say 100% certainty that you would in fact have more spatters on it from it, but obviously anything that's in proximity you would expect to potentially see blood spatter from the impacts.
And that goes for any individuals who may have been involved in inflicting these wounds as well, correct?
That's correct.
You would expect that anybody with who was participating in inflicting those wounds would be covered in blood such that anything they touched would have blood transfer upon it, correct?
That's correct. If you went straight from killing her to touching anything else, that you would expect there would be some significant blood transfers.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Fuchs asked you about whether it was possible that Tamaya was sitting on the couch and shot in the back of the head when somebody entered the home. Isn't it true that there was stippling around the gunshot wound to the back of her head?
Yes.
Indicating that the shot was fired within 6 to 12 inches of her head?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. So anybody who inflicted that wound would have had to have captured her independent of whatever was going on with the other kids or Brandy and fired the shot directly into the back of her head.
Well, what I can say is that it's close. So exactly how that happened or what took place, I really can't say. But just at the moment of the shot, that the firearm is very close to her head.
To be clear, though, it's not as if somebody could have just walked in the door and fired the shot from 8 or 10 feet away.
That's correct. That's correct.
No further questions.
All right. Hey, Jerry, I have a question of this one. All right, write your question down. We'll go sidebar. I have a couple of questions from the jury. Were you aware there were some gold teeth found near Miss Peters' body?
Yes, sir.
Did you attach any significance to those?
No, there wasn't anything there to associate those to any particular individual or anything like that. So.
Could the dynamic nature and possible length of the struggle indicate that there was more than one attacker?
I don't know that I could diagnose the number of attackers just on the basis of the dynamic struggle.
And this may be out of your area of expertise, but the question was asked, so we'll ask a question. Do you have an opinion whether one person could have forced Miss Peters back into the home?
I don't think I could exclude the possibility that it's one person.
Were the children's shoes excluded from the patterns that you saw in the various locations?
There weren't any standards for the children's shoes submitted, but the sizes of most of the patterns would have been larger than I would expect for children's shoes.
Any follow-up, Mr. Prince?
Yes,
Now, one of the questions pertained to the length, I suppose temporal length of the struggle and the dynamic nature, and you indicated based on that you couldn't diagnose that multiple individuals were involved. When you try to form an opinion about the potential involvement of multiple individuals, do you look more at things like the number and nature of shoe impressions, the number and nature of wounds inflicted?
Yes, because a dynamic struggle says more about the condition of the victim and what she's doing than it necessarily tells you about what any attackers are doing. It just means that in comparison to a scene where you have a victim that's not fighting back and all the wounds are all in the same direction and things like that, clearly here there is a dynamic struggle.
Okay, and just to be clear about the footwear that the girls had, well, I guess let's talk about all four victims. Brandy had socks on, correct?
That's correct.
Javante was
Barefoot, correct?
That's correct.
Tanaya had one slipper on. The other slipper was located near the entrance to the hallway, correct?
I think that's correct, yes.
And then lastly, Tanaya had white sandals on, correct?
I think that's correct, yes.
And based on the size of the other impressions, at least the portions of those impressions you could see, those were not consistent with being impressions left by child-sized shoes, correct?
Right. It was never my impression that any of those came from children's shoes.
Fuchs?
The struggle length said you really couldn't form an opinion. You would agree that more than one person, the more people there are attacking Miss Peters, the easier it is to subdue her.
That would be correct. The thing is having a particular benchmark as to what would indicate one or two or three. That it really says more about her than it does about the number of attackers.
But again, if there's more than one attacker, especially when we're talking about 7 attackers, a lot easier to subdue Miss Peters in a shorter time frame than what we witnessed, correct?
Right. I think that's correct.
And then those gold teeth, they were consistent with being actually from Miss Peters, correct? They were found next to her earrings, right next to her body.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't recall seeing anything that identified whose they were, but they certainly could have been from her.
Especially given the brutality of the attack.
That's correct.
And once again, those shoe impressions we're talking about, again, they're patterns that could possibly be shoe prints. You're not saying they are in fact shoe prints.
That's correct.
No further questions.
Mr. Prince?
nothing.
All right, you can step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
The next witness, Mr. Prince.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense was raised.
All right, only take 10 minutes. We'll let you step out with the deputy.
I would like to take 5 minutes with that 10 minutes to confer with counsel.
Okay. Okay, all right, I figured you maybe wanted a few minutes. Anything else we need to discuss?
So, I guess at this point, it would be appropriate for me to renew JOA at the same references.
Yeah, I think actually at the end of the state's case, but is when it's
Yes.
into their rebuttal would be the critical time. So, anyway, you need more than 10 minutes, Mr. Fuchs, or 10 minutes enough?
I guess give me 10 minutes to get upstairs and consult with the rest of the people that are live streaming this, and give me 15 total if you don't mind.
All right, take 15 minutes.
Thank you.
All right.